All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're stepping right into the war room to impartially analyze the staggering battlefield strategies of two commanders who, frankly, fundamentally changed the globe. If we put on our military historian hats and look back through the centuries, certain campaigns stand out, not just for their sheer scale, but for the absolute audacity of the men leading them. Today, we're putting Alexander the Great and Hernán Cortés side by side to see exactly how they managed to topple absolute giants. So let's dive into this immense strategic dilemma right out of the gate. How exactly did both of these leaders manage to survive, let alone conquer, while facing such impossible, overwhelming numerical odds? Just think about this for a second. Alexander marched into Asia with roughly 40,000 men. He's going up against a Persian Empire that could field up to 100,000 troops at major battles like Issus. That is huge. And Cortés, even more incredibly, he landed with just a few hundred Spaniards against an Aztec empire of literally millions. There's just no way that works on paper, right? To figure out how they pulled this off, we're going to run through a tactical military briefing. We'll be covering facing impossible odds, battlefield tactics and technology, leveraging local alliances, the decisive strikes, and finally, we'll look at the long-term political consequences of it all. Okay, starting with Section 1, facing impossible odds and surviving the unknown. Both of these commanders operated deep in hostile territory against multinational superpower empires that totally possessed the capacity to wipe them out through sheer attrition alone. The absolute biggest threat they faced right away is logistical overextension. Basically, that's the extreme vulnerability of trying to supply a tiny, isolated military force operating incredibly far from its home base. Alexander, for instance, marched for a decade, pushing his army all the way to the edge of the known world. Cortés, on the other hand, well, he arrived in Mesoamerica in an open act of mutiny against his own governor. He actually intentionally scuttled his own ships to eliminate any chance of retreat. He literally forced his small band of men to march forward on a city of over 300,000 people. It was, quite literally, conquer or die. Moving on to Section 2, battlefield tactics and technology and how they outclassed the enemy. To survive without a supply line, both leaders had to completely outclass their enemies on the battlefield. And when we directly contrast the technological disparities each military deployed to overcome those crazy numbers, a really fascinating difference emerges. Alexander relied heavily on the physical, kinetic shock of his elite companion cavalry. He was actively breaking enemy lines through sheer blunt force. Cortés, conversely, maximized the terrifying auditory and psychological shock of early firearms, cannons, and horses. I mean, these were things the Aztecs had never even seen before, and he used them to completely disrupt massive enemy formations. But, for Alexander, that kinetic cavalry shock was actually only possible because of the Macedonian Phalanx. This was a highly professional infantry formation packed 16 ranks deep, and they wielded these massive 18-foot pikes called Sarissas. Alexander essentially anchored his battle lines with this dense, impenetrable wall of iron. Because the enemy just couldn't break through the phalanx, Alexander's highly mobile cavalry was freed up to precisely strike the enemy's flanks. It's basically the ultimate hammer and anvil tactic. But hey, superior weapons aren't enough when you're outnumbered 10 to 1. That brings us to Section 3, leveraging local alliances and weaponizing fractures. To prevent total annihilation, both men had to become master diplomats, weaponizing the pre-existing political fractures within the empires they invaded. Understanding the brutal reality of the Aztec flower wars is absolutely crucial here. See, the Aztec Triple Alliance actively subjugated their tributaries to harvest thousands of prisoners for human sacrifice. And realizing exactly why Cortés found thousands of willing native allies is really the key to understanding his entire campaign. The Tlascalans, for instance, violently hated their Aztec overlords who had been harassing them for nearly a century. Cortés simply convinced them they had a common enemy, essentially turning his 400 Spaniards into a massive army of thousands. We see this exact same concept built into Alexander's strategy too, through massive diplomatic force multipliers. He didn't just conquer, he assimilated. He actually allowed the priests of Egypt to crown him pharaoh. He kept loyal Persian viceroys in their posts. He absorbed surrendered troops right into his own ranks, allied with local Indian kings, and he even orchestrated a massive marriage ceremony of his officers to Persian noblewomen at Susa. He was actively trying to fuse Greek and Persian nobility to stabilize his new conquests. However, as military historians, we've got to impartially observe that both leaders also employed brutal violence as a calculated political tool. this wasn't just mindless destruction, it was strategic terror. Cortés and his native allies massacred the civilian population at the religious center of Cholula, clearly demonstrating to rival cities exactly what would happen if they didn't ally with him. And similarly, Alexander ordered the Persian ceremonial capital of Persepolis to be pillaged and burnt to the ground, which was basically calculated retribution for the Persian invasion of Greece over a century prior. Now, this brings us to Section 4, the decisive strikes, those all-or-nothing battles. Because despite their careful diplomacy and strategic use of terror, the fate of both of these campaigns eventually hinged on massive, all-or-nothing tactical engagements. Let's look at the Battle of Gaugamela. Alexander was vastly outnumbered here, yet he executed a completely flawless tactical maneuver. He led his right wing outward, essentially drawing the massive Persian line with him and stretching it incredibly thin. Once a gap opened up in the Persian center, boom, he formed a wedge with his elite companion cavalry and charged directly at the Persian king, Darius III. The sheer ferocity of that strike caused Darius to flee and the entire Persian army completely routed. It was an absolute masterclass in exploiting a single moment of weakness. Cortés's decisive strike, however, was a totally different story. It was a grinding urban nightmare. Fleeing the island city of Tenochtitlan during the infamous Night of Sorrows, his men were totally bogged down by stolen gold, attacked by hundreds of canoes in a massive rainstorm, and many drowned in the causeways. He lost all his artillery, most of his horses, and hundreds of his men. The disaster was so absolute that, according to chroniclers, Cortés literally broke down in tears. He had to completely rebuild his force, utilizing his Tlascalan allies to slowly lay siege to the city with improvised boats. But the ultimate, most lethal, decisive blow in Mesoamerica was completely unseen biological warfare. 8 million. That is the estimated number of indigenous people killed by smallpox by 1520. Having absolutely no prior contact with the disease, the vulnerable Aztecs were entirely at its mercy. It killed their emperor and completely, totally devastated their demographic capacity to resist the Spanish siege. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, long-term political consequences and the geopolitical aftermath. The really crucial point here is grasping the geopolitical aftermath that permanently altered the trajectory of these vast regions. Alexander's decade of conquest birthed the Hellenistic Age, actively fusing Greek art, science, and government with local Eastern traditions. On the flip side, Cortés's campaign triggered the fall of Mesoamerica, which was then followed by mass Catholic conversion, widespread intermarriage between ethnic Spaniards and natives, and the incredibly violent, complex birth of the modern Mexican nation. Yet, despite their almost godlike historical status, neither commander was immune to the limits of human endurance. Over at the River Hyphasis, Alexander's invincible army finally just mutinied against the endless conquests. They had marched thousands of miles, fought for 8 years straight, and simply refused to go any further. Alexander ended up dying of a fever shortly after, at just 32 years old, and his massive empire shattered into rival kingdoms almost immediately. It really revealed that the whole thing was held together only by his sheer willpower. So as you reflect on these two world-altering campaigns, it really leaves us with a profound question. Does true military genius actually lie in brilliant battlefield tactics, or is it in the ruthless manipulation of local politics? Was it the 18-foot Sarissa and Spanish gunpowder that truly toppled these vast empires, or simply the masterful exploitation of their enemies' pre-existing political fractures? It's a really fascinating debate, and I hope this explainer has given you the strategic insight to decide for yourself.